So a bit of a background to the project. This is a sort of scheme that we've been developing over a number of years, and it's a 4-kilometre bypass on the A120, which is one of our key east-west transport corridors in the county. And essentially there's a bottleneck at the moment, a set of traffic signals in the village of Little Hadham. The scheme also collaborates with the Environment Agency, where we're providing flood alleviation to significant flood dam structures essentially that are combined with the road on the River Ash and the Albury tributary. If I can just have the next slide, please. It's a multi-agency scheme, so Hertfordshire County Council, the lead partner, again we're managing the contract and delivering it, but we've also secured funding from the Department for Transport, the Hertfordshire Local Enterprise Partnership, because of the significance of the scheme to jobs and housing growth in the county. Again, obviously the Environment Agency as the regional flood and coastal, through their body called the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee, and they've also provided us funding through something called a defence granting aid, flood defence granting aid. If I can just have the next slide. These are some progress photos of how it looks on site. So we started on site, we've been out there for about a year and a half now, and essentially we're now at the stage where a number of the key structures that you can see here are nearing completion. We've got the Albury Road Bridge there, we've got the Hadham Park underpass, which again might come into on some of the ecology mitigation, and then the bottom right hand corner, that's one of the main flood alleviation structures, and the spillway associated with that. But yeah, we're very much at the stage where we're hoping to open the project to the public this winter, so hopefully just before Christmas if the weather and other factors remain in our favour. The next slide, please. I'm now going to pass on to Steve, who's going to talk to you about the flood alleviation side of the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. So as you can see on the slide there, the village of Little Hadham and Hadham Ford, a bit further down the valley, have suffered flooding and have done for a number of years. And it's quite regular as well. I mean, with 6 major flood events between 47 and 2014. And our modelling shows that 72 properties are at risk in up to 1 in 100 chance flood event, with the first ones getting wet in a 20% annual chance, which is a 1 in 5 bet. So it is a real issue for the village, and the flooding also interrupts traffic on the A120 on occasion. So if we go to the next slide, please. So I should have just finished that off in saying that we've looked at providing flood alleviation ourselves previously, but that's what was unaffordable on its own merits. However, with the bypass being built, we were able to progress the scheme. And what does the scheme involve? It involves, as Dave has mentioned, using the road embankments as flood storage, and that's both across the main River Ash Valley and also across the Albury tributary. And in an extreme flood, up to 1 in 100 chance, the volumes of water involved are quite large. For the Ash, for example, is 435,000 cubic meters of water can be stored. And the Albury tributary a bit smaller, 11,700. So they have potential to hold back a lot of water, but you will see on the picture there that there's a third watercourse coming in called the Lloyd Drain, and that currently goes through a culvert under houses which couldn't be enlarged, and so we're diverting that around the south of the housing so that all 3 watercourses that converge in Little Hadham have their flood alleviation measures on them, and in total the scheme will benefit all properties that are at risk at the 1 in 100 chance, and so they'll have a great improvement from river flooding. And if we could go to the next slide, please. So how have we adapted the design of the flood structures to take account of the ecological interest in the area? Well, first of all, we need to bear in mind that reservoir safety is paramount in the design, really, because with the volumes of water that could be stored, 435,000, for example, each cubic meter of water is a ton. And if that was accidentally released, then there could be a real risk to life and property. But bearing that in mind, we also need to recognise that the watercourses, although they're dry most of the time, are also designated as chalk streams because of the underlying geology. And so we needed to design the structures to be both robust and take account of that special interest. And the way that we've adapted the structures is to try and use materials which are geologically compatible with chalk. For rock armour, the rock armour is needed to protect against erosion of the embankments by flood flows. But in order to, so we've gone for a limestone because the chalk obviously dissolves. So the limestone is more robust, and that will be covered with natural gravels to try and replicate the riverbed conditions in the area. And if we can have the next slide, please. So I've mentioned that we're diverting the Lloyd Taylor drain. This is actually an opportunity to create 400 metres of new channel. Again, the watercourse only really flows in response to heavy rainfall because it seeps into the chalk with drizzle, with low levels of rainfall and drizzle. And again, we've aimed to replicate the natural river channels. And you can see there in the bottom photograph that we've used local gravels along the bed. And it's not while it looks a straight course, for flood flows it will be, but down in the bottom of the riverbed, there's a slightly meandering course so that slower flows have a more natural meandering bed. And the slopes of the channel will be vegetated with a wildflower grass mix, and the watercourse actually becomes quite steep because to take it out of its current course, it needed to contour around the side of a slope and then drop more steeply down. And obviously where it drops more steeply down, there is a risk of erosion. So the channel bed is actually lined with a turf reinforcement mattress that will be again covered in gravels that will be trapped within it in the bed to stop them being washed away. And again, the banks themselves will be planted with the wildflower mix. Where that all goes into a culvert underneath the road between Little Hadham and Hadham Ford, the forces, hydraulic forces, again can be quite large. So we've done the same sort of thing as we are doing at the reservoirs, in that the rock armour that's necessary is geologically compatible with the chalk, and again will be covered up with local gravels. And those gravels will extend through the culvert to give an ecological continuity to the bed through the structure. And I think that's the time to hand on to Luke to look at the wider environmental impact assessment.
Thanks, Steve, and hello, everyone. So the type and scale of the A120 bypass project required an environmental impact assessment to assess the impacts of the scheme on the environment and to give us the opportunity to demonstrate where the existing environment had shaped the design of the scheme. So the environmental statement, or the ES for short, is a document produced as part of the EIA, and that includes a chapter on ecology, and that really will be the focus of my talk today. The ecological assessment considers impacts on ecological features in three broad categories listed here. So that's designated nature conservation sites, habitats, and protected and notable species. And the objectives of that work really were to identify the valuable ecological features that are relevant to the project, and then to apply a mitigation hierarchy approach to the design. And what that means is that we work really hard to avoid impacts to existing ecological features wherever possible, and where that isn't possible, we look to minimise and mitigate the impacts of construction and operation upon those features. And then finally, where such impacts are unavoidable and there are residual effects, we design compensation measures to address those residual impacts. And furthermore, we look to provide ecological enhancement measures to go above and beyond that and benefit nature. The conclusions of the environmental statement are an important consideration in the process for gaining planning consent for the scheme. And that consent requires the various environmental measures committed to within the ES to be delivered as part of the construction project. Next slide, please. So on to ecology and ecology surveys. To gather a robust baseline, we undertook a wide suite of ecological surveys from 2014 to 2017 to allow us to understand the local wildlife. This included habitat mapping surveys and then a really wide range of surveys for different species groups as listed in that first bullet point. The scope of those surveys was informed by consultation with key nature conservation stakeholders. This includes the council ecologist, Martin Hicks, who I think is joining us on the call today, and also the Herts and Middlesex Wildlife Trust and local bat specialists. And the local bat group were really interested due to pre-existing records of a rare bat species called barbastelle. And what that resulted in was us undertaking a really quite extensive series of advanced bat survey work, focusing on radio tracking studies. Now, radio tracking comprises the capture of bats under a license, and then affixing tiny radio transmitters temporarily to the backs of the bats, so that we can then track their movements over several days, and then eventually the glue wears out after a few days and the tag falls off and the bat goes about its business undisturbed. As you can see from the image of my colleague here, radio tracking bats is really quite a good workout for the shoulders, because it involves walking around for the entire period of the night, essentially, with a receiver. And what you do is you have 2 or more staff taking bearings from an individual bat using these receivers, and using that information, using those bearings to be able to triangulate an accurate location of where the bat is, how it's spending its time throughout the night. So it's a really valuable survey technique, and it gathers information that you just couldn't obtain in any other way, for a tiny nocturnal creature that is covering a wide distance. So next slide, please. You get to see what a barbastelle bat looks like. This is a nationally rare bat species. It roosts in mature woodlands. It's quite distinctive to look at. It's got this black pug-like face and large ears that meet in the middle. Most importantly, I think it's the British bat species that looks the most like Darth Vader. It roosts typically in hollow trees and in loose bark within woodlands, and this is actually a factor that makes them quite vulnerable, because these kind of trees full of cracks and holes and splits are often the very best for biodiversity, but are often considered by land managers to be trees in poor condition that need tidying up or removal. There's only a couple of known breeding colonies in the whole of Hertfordshire for this bat species, so their presence was highly significant, and quite a constraint on the design of the scheme that needed to be thoroughly considered. We learnt from the radio tracking studies that the bats regularly cross the existing A120 just to the east of the bypass scheme, lying between Bloodhounds Wood and Little Plantings Wood, which you can see on this image occur just to the west of that roundabout on the edge of Bishop Stortford. That woodland complex there is where the bats really are centred. And despite weighing only around 10 grams each, these amazing creatures cover on average around 5 kilometers a night. And that's what that image on the slide is showing you, is an output of the radio tracking for an individual bat, showing you its range and where it was flying, and also the core habitat patches where it spends most of its time. So what they tend to do is radiate out from the woodland, and then find small discrete foraging patches. So they actually spend about 90% of the night within only 10% of the range, where they are foraging essentially for their prey species, which are largely moths. Next slide, please. These bats shift regularly between their tree roosts in woodlands. So actually finding the specific tree that the bats are roosting in is like finding a needle in a haystack. And that radio tracking is essential to allow us to locate the bats. So what we're able to do is survey in the daytime with the radio receiver and find out where the bats are located. And then, as you can see here from the images, we can set up thermal imaging cameras, which will then allow us to record the emergence of bats when we get to the evening. So in this case, we've got a maternity colony of barbastelle in Bloodhounds Wood, and we managed to record that being used by up to 40 breeding female bats at a time. So that demonstrates that this wood and its surrounds are really critically important to the survival of the bat colony. So that's what they're doing, and if we go to the next slide, we can show how we responded to that within the design of the scheme. So there's three key areas of barbastelle mitigation I'm going to give you an overview of. The first is mitigation for foraging. So within the scheme footprint, we lose around 3.7 kilometers of hedge and tree lines that we demonstrated were used by these bats. And the mitigation approach includes provision of around 8 kilometers of new species rich in hedge and trees within the scheme boundary. But obviously that will take some time to establish, and also there is a degree of disturbance from that habitat planting being adjacent to roads with noise and lighting impacts from vehicles. So what we did was look for additional opportunities to create 4 kilometres of non-roadside planting further away from the scheme to enhance the wider countryside within the range of these bats. So we undertook an extensive exercise looking at lots of different land parcels within 5 kilometres of Bloodhounds Wood. And what we were looking for was opportunities to reinstate connections, reinstate natural corridors of hedgerow and trees, where hedges may have been previously removed, or where there were blocks of woodland that would benefit from connectivity between them, that would help the bats move between their foraging and foraging areas and roosts. So we identified locations and have planted 4 kilometres of new hedgerow, which will be managed to become wide and tall features, which are preferred by the bats and provide shelter for those moth species that I've described. And you can see here in the image just one of the plans that shows enhancement and creation of new hedgerow links, and then an image of some new hedgerow planting. If we can go to the next slide, please. The second element of the barbastelle mitigation I'm going to describe relates to the use of the existing underpass under the A120 at the eastern end of the scheme. We demonstrated through radio tracking that complex of woodlands was vital to the survival of the colony, and they needed to be able to continue to use that underpass undisturbed. So the design respected that and pulled any form of lighting impact back from the underpass. So we've gone obviously for the bare minimum that's required for safety, but we looked very closely at the type, the colour, the height, and the location of the lighting to get to the position you can see in the lighting contour plan. Which I appreciate you can't see the legend, but that outer contour of the lighting around Hadham Park Underpass is really a low level of around half a lux, which is lower than the level of light that would come from a full moon, essentially. So we've kept lighting impacts well away from the underpass. We've preserved the vegetation in close proximity to the underpass, and we've actually strengthened it as well. You can see on the image there's some planting shown on the right hand side of that image, and that's to bolster the links to that underpass for the bats, and to encourage them to continue to use that feature alongside the scheme. Next slide, please. We also, as part of the design of the scheme, also took the opportunity to design a farm accommodation track that was required close to Bloodhounds Wood in a way that would benefit the bats. So what we've done is ensure that the dimensions of that underpass are sufficient to be used by bats, because there's research that shows that you need at least 5 by 5 meter openings to encourage bats to use a feature. And the landscaping will ensure that there's gentle approach slopes to that underpass. I think they're around 1 in 10. So the idea is to create a natural feeling landform along that farm track. So we'll have double hedgerow either side, creating a foraging link for bats and a commuting link for bats that leads them down to fly beneath the underpass and giving them safe crossing beneath the road at that point, avoiding the risk of vehicle collision. So that's a summary of what we've done for Barbastell. I'll now, if we can move to the next slide, talk about one of the other key species that we encountered as part of this project, and that's Roman snail. So Roman snail are the largest species of land snail in the UK. They're quite long-lived. They can live for up to 20 years. They're often limited to quite small, isolated colonies, as they have specific needs. They need calcareous soils to provide the calcium they need to grow their large shells. They need rough vegetation to shelter from predators, and they need areas of loose and exposed soil in sunny areas so they can lay their eggs. And we found a few colonies of Roman snail through our surveys, particularly around Upwick Green Road, which was to be upgraded and widened as part of the scheme. And this is a protected species. It's illegal to kill or injure Roman snail. They were originally listed for protection due to over-collection. As I'm sure you know, on the continent, they're very fond of eating snails, and this is the species that is most favoured. And so there have been periods of collection of these snails for export, and that had to be halted to prevent their decline. So they were listed for protection for that reason. But the knock-on consequence of that is that development works that would kill or injure these snails are essentially illegal unless we take all reasonable measures to avoid harming them. And so it's not an option to just displace them into adjacent habitat. Apparently, a Roman snail only moves 30 meters in its entire lifetime, so it's not gonna be displaced to adjacent habitat easily. So we needed to create something somewhere else to move these snails to. And before I move on to that, I'll just describe what the image in the centre is showing you, because I'm sure it's causing some confusion. This species is only really active between kind of May to August, September, and particularly in damp conditions. And we needed prolonged periods to be able to capture 500 snails. And so we worked with Graham's to come up with this innovative measure, really, to continually wet the verges along Upwick Green Road using this bowser with a specially adapted backplate that spread the water far and wide. And that was really helpful, because what it allowed us to do is, rather than just tightly following the weather forecast, it allowed us to continue to artificially water the habitat and keep capturing the snails, bringing them out so we could catch more of them and move them to safety within a time frame that worked for the programme of the scheme. Next slide, please. We'll see the habitat that has been created. So we identified a suitable translocation site adjacent to the scheme, which had the right soils that we were looking for. And this is an area of arable land just to the east of the River Ash flood storage area, that's fragmented from the wider agricultural land holding by the scheme, creating a good opportunity to provide some compensatory habitat for Roman snail. So we've created 1.2 hectares of wildflower and rough grassland habitat at this location. And what we've also done is taken the opportunity to use Site 1 materials in the form of the felled timber from many of the trees that were lost to the scheme. And this is a really good opportunity for sustainable reuse of that wood to create lots of earth-covered log piles, which will provide shelter for the snails and provide real variation within the habitat. Lots of interesting topography and small slopes with sunny microclimates, which are good for the snails, but also good for a lot of other species in the countryside. The next slide, please. Oh, I think we've missed one potentially. I think we have a slide with the headlines where we've appeared in the local press with Roman snails. I don't know if that's there, Victoria.
Sorry, Luke, it doesn't seem to be in this set.
Oh, okay.
One. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Well, the slide that has gone AWOL is essentially a couple of screen grabs. There's a BBC News article and there's a Daily Mail article, basically demonstrating that the Roman snails certainly captured media attention into the national press. And I had the pleasure of being interviewed as well on BBC Three Counties Radio about the snails and the translocation, because it's a fairly unusual activity. I was certainly ready to answer questions on the project in that radio interview, but I was a little less prepared. I think that the host asked me if I thought I was like a James Bond of the ecology world, traveling around on a secret rescue mission for protected species. So that was the first time in my career I've been asked that question, and was a new experience for me. I'm not sure what the answer is still, even yet. But yeah, the media coverage was certainly good for the profile of the project, and was really great at demonstrating to a wide audience that we were doing the right thing with respect to the environment. Okay, I've caught up with the slides now. So the final species I'm going to focus on is great crested newts. Great crested newts have suffered massive historic declines in their populations due to the intensification of farming in the 20th century and the loss, the general trend to lose ponds from the landscape. And as a result, they're a highly protected species. We undertook surveys that identified 3 great crested newt breeding ponds. As you can see here, there's to the east of the River Ash flood storage area, and also there's populations down near Hadham Park Underpass and Hadham Park Roundabout. But the key thing about newts is that they spend most of the year actually on land in terrestrial habitat, well away from their ponds. And it's another tiny creature that travels a very long way. So they can go up to 1 kilometre, but they're often, pretty commonly found going up to 250 metres from their ponds, which is why they frequently crop up as a constraint on development. No doubt we've all seen the headlines and Boris's statement about newt counters and the like. They are often seen as a barrier to development, and it's because they range so far that even on a scheme like this, where we were really successful in designing to avoid the loss of the ponds, it's impossible to, in this context, to avoid the types of habitat that newts are going to roam into it and use. So if we move on to the next slide, please. Our mitigation, we needed a European protected species license from Natural England to be able to carefully search newt habitat and exclude these animals from the scheme by translocation. So in the left image, you can see some newt exclusion fencing, and at the front you can see a sunken pitfall trap. And that's what we use to capture newts. Sometimes the simple techniques are the best. It's essentially a bucket sunk into the ground, and the newt that is using habitat within the scheme, which is to the left-hand side of the fence, would undertake one of its migratory movements towards its ponds. It would hit the barrier of the fence, and then it would just start walking along the fence. And then, of course, it would just drop into the bucket. So the key task is for the ecologist to get there nice and early in the morning and find the newt before the magpies do, and capture it and relocate it to somewhere safe beyond the fence where it's heading. And then the fence is preventing the newts getting back into the scheme, so we can demonstrate that we're clear to remove that habitat and can move to construction. There was habitat creation for newts. So the other image is what we call a hibernacular, which is a fancy word for a half-buried pile of logs and stone, which creates little frost-free pockets that allow great-crested newts to hibernate within. So there's a range of those features across the scheme. If we can have the next slide, please. Just very briefly, I focused on 3 key species, but there were plenty of others that were relevant to the scheme that we looked at. So in brief, there's a range of badger sets in this landscape, and we were able to retain all of the main sets, the important sets where badgers spent are permanently occupying throughout the year. But we also needed to design for the safety of badgers and for vehicles to minimise the chance of road collisions. So there's exclusion fencing to be erected along the length of the scheme, with the exception of the flood storage embankments, where that's upgraded to a badger mesh or a netting, which is pinned to the ground. Clearly, it's critical that mammal burrowing is prevented on the slopes of an embankment that's impounding a reservoir, essentially. So that was a really important part of the specification. But that fencing then leads the badgers to a number of safe crossing places within the scheme. There's a dedicated badger tunnel through one of the embankments. There's also adaptation of the culvert that carries Cradle End Brook, which includes mammal ledges, so that badgers can walk above the watercourse when it's in flood and still safely cross beneath the scheme at that point. And there's a couple of other culverts and underpasses that provide routes for badgers to move beneath the scheme, avoiding vehicle collisions. Barn owl were also recorded in the baseline survey. And so the planting design includes some hopovers, which is specific locations where more mature planting is put in on both sides of the scheme to encourage barn owl to fly up and over traffic and reduce the risk of collisions. And also there's some provision of off-site nesting boxes further away from the scheme on some other council-owned land. And then as part of the pre-construction clearance programme, there was a lot of ecological clerk of works activity, working very closely with Graham, the contractor on site, to ensure that the methods and the timing of clearance of habitat were sensitive to species like nesting birds and avoided harm. And then if we can just move on to my final slide, please, Victoria. This is to summarise that the scheme really delivers a quantum of ecological enhancement of which we can be proud, delivering over 8 kilometres of new species-rich native hedgerows, over 2 hectares of tree and scrub planting, 8 hectares of calcareous grassland, and also local watercourse enhancements. And all of these will diversify habitats for wildlife within what is a largely agricultural landscape, where features like diverse grassland are really quite uncommon. That brings me to the end of my slides. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. Before we start the questions, I'm Dan Granger, I'm project sponsor for the A120 bypass. So I suppose just like to, if you could join me in a virtual round of applause for David's introduction and Steve and Luke's excellent presentations. I think we're all thankful for that. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the site team from WSP Arup that have been out supervising the project, and also our contractor Graham. It has been a challenging 2 years with COVID and a number of extreme weather events, but we are getting there. Hopefully, open by Christmas. So that's an excellent achievement. So I think we'll move over to questions. I'll start while I'm waiting. Really, Luke. One of the things I recall from when we were talking about bats was they were described as stealth bats. I wonder if you could elaborate on their particular skill set.
Yeah, sure. So this is why the barber still has such big ears, really. There's an evolutionary arms race between the moths that they're trying to capture and the bats. So the bats are able to echolocate to find the moths, but the moths, certain moth species evolve a way of hearing bats, so they can hear them coming and avoid them. And so, yeah, often these bats are having to use stealthy tactics to approach their moth prey. And as I say, there's this constant arms race to who's going to win out in that activity, and that's why they look so interesting as well.
Thanks, Luke. Any questions from anyone else? I can't see any hands up at the moment. Anyone feel brave enough to ask a question?
Darren, there is one question in the chat from Lynn.
I can't see the chat, I'm afraid.
No problem. So, Luke, we've got a question. Will there be any follow-up monitoring to show how the bats, snails and grey-crested newts are doing in their new homes?
Yes, that's the short answer. For all three of those species, we've got quite detailed programs of monitoring surveys over the course of the next few years to allow us to see whether the design of those habitats has indeed benefited the species in the way that we believe they will, and to then inform any changes that might be required to habitat management if we think that those are required as well. So that was part of the environmental statement, that commitment to monitoring, and yeah, will be delivered over the course of the next few years. It'll be really interesting, really interesting to give this presentation in 5 years' time, really, and all the monitoring results, hopefully.
Thanks, Luke. Another question just come in. So, surprising how long the snails seem to live. How often do they reproduce over their lifetime, and how many?
So snail, I mean, they lay a lot of eggs, hundreds of eggs, and reproduce quite freely. So where you get the right conditions for Roman snail, you get large numbers of them. Hence why we found nearly 500 of them along some quite narrow road verges. I think that the limiting factor, and they're quite generalist in what they'll eat. They're not like a rare butterfly species that has a caterpillar that requires a specific food plant that's in decline. They'll eat quite a wide range of vegetation. So really the limiting factor is the soil. If you get the right kind of soil conditions with that calcium available for uptake in the form of calcium carbonate and loose friable soils, or in a mosaic of habitat with rough vegetation where they've got the cover and the foraging, then you'll get hundreds, if not thousands, of snails. But the limiting factor is that those habitat conditions don't occur in very many places with the way in which we kind of manage our countryside.
Thanks, Luke. A question on the enhancement figures that were shown on the previous slide. Is that in terms of net gain, or is that purely mitigation for the loss of existing habitats?
The figures on the slide are the total creation of habitats within the scheme. This scheme, I mean, the question suggests an understanding of kind of net gain, biodiversity net gain, which is the way that development is going. So if we were starting off design of this scheme now, we'd be subject to a whole different set of requirements relating to demonstrating a net gain in biodiversity measured under a metric. And calculating units, and that would shape the design of the scheme. But this scheme predates that regime. And so those figures are very much about how much is provided within the scheme. I mean, I can, rule of thumb, I mean, some rough maths. I mean, there's 8 kilometres of new hedgerow planting within the scheme, and on one of the earlier slides I showed there was just over 3.5 kilometres of loss. So in that example, we've got over 4 kilometres in net gain in length of hedgerow. And similarly, for calcareous grassland, the figure on the slide is 8 hectares of calcareous grassland. There's next to none of that habitat loss within the scheme, and that was what I was alluding to really within my final comments, is that type of habitat doesn't tend to occur in the wider countryside any longer because of the intensification of farming. So there are certainly some net gains. The figures at the end are neither a calculation of net gain or just mitigation. They are what's within the scheme, and some of that planting forms the mitigation for some of the protected and notable species that we've encountered.
Great. And a final question that I can see in the chat. Pleased to see that the new hedgerows are doing so well. Perhaps some of the larger trees that have been planted looks like they may have died. Will any of those in that circumstance be replaced? Just a question to the site team on that.
As far as I'm aware, we are looking at replacing some of those dead trees within certain hedgerow sections. I mean, I think we might have overplanted in terms of what we needed, but yeah, there are some that are being replaced. I'd have to check exact numbers with the site team, but I know that has been discussed.
Thanks, Darren. I think we did have a brief hand up from Martin Hicks earlier. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Martin.
No, not at all. It was a very good presentation. My hand was up by mistake because I couldn't get rid of it. Okay. But I'd just like to say, yes, in terms of net gain, that wasn't a requirement when the scheme was started, and it still isn't a requirement legally at the moment. But all such schemes now would be expected to achieve that, and clearly this scheme does contribute to additional and different habitat resources that wouldn't otherwise have been there. So that doesn't mean to say it's a good excuse to cover everywhere with roads, but the other issue, of course, is the long-term management of some of these features. Road diverges tend to sort of morph into more rank grassland over time, but that's another issue. But I think the scheme as it represents at the moment is probably an example, a really good exemplar of its kind in relation to how biodiversity has been addressed, particularly in relation to the really rare barbastelle bat, although that does appear to be occurring all over the place now, probably because it's easier to record. The technology has improved, but it's still very rare, and clearly the measures that have been taken, hopefully they will work. So well done.
Thanks, Martin. Great to hear that.
I don't want Steve to feel left out, so I'm going to ask Steve a question. And Steve, you mentioned about the natural gravels through the culverts. Do you want to explain a little bit more about other measures we've done under the Water Framework Directive?
Yeah. Briefly, certainly, yes. The Water Framework Directive was a European-based legislation, which is obviously still applicable, to try and bring water courses into good ecological condition. And the scheme is obviously culverting some sections of watercourse to pass through embankments, and so there was an assessment carried out by my colleagues about what the impacts were and what the potential gains were, and generation of the new channel was a good opportunity to mitigate some of the culverting. There was an existing concrete bed further upstream, and that has been taken out, and the riverbed's going to be naturalised while still protecting what was the concrete was protecting, which was erosion under a bridge and potentially a private water supply. So there's a bit of naturalisation there, but in trying to maintain the natural riverbed through the culverts, as well as the gravels, underneath that, the actual concrete surface itself has been roughened, so it will trap small sediments and also provide a continuity for invertebrates and things to crawl through the culverts, through the gravels and everything like that. So, and overall, it was found that the under the WFD assessment that we were having no net. It was not making it worse, so it was neutral overall, taking into account the measures that we were doing.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, well, if there's no further questions, I'll give everyone 10 minutes of their day back. I think we had an hour slot, and I'm sure everyone will appreciate that. So, yeah, if we have no further questions, then yeah, thanks again to Luke and Steve and Dave for their presentations, and thank you all for joining. Hopefully you found it interesting. Maybe we'll see you again for another one of these. If I'm not sure if we've got any more planned, but we are getting to the end of the scheme now. So thanks all and enjoy the rest of your sunny day. Thank you.
Thanks all.